Welcome back to Impact Makers, your product experience marketing podcast. And if GLP-1s have been on your radar, or frankly, anywhere near your commercial strategy, then this is a time we really want your attention.
Yeah, because we've dropped 2 special episodes on the subject, both looking at the same fast-moving disruption from different angles. So in our companion episode, GLP-1 Rewiring Consumption, we dig into MMR's latest global research, what GLP-1s are doing to appetite, cravings, sensory experiences, food noise, and the rules of product success.
And in this episode, we go broader. We bring the debate into the room with experts in clinical science, behavioral science, culture, and product experience to ask what happens next.
So our aim with both these episodes is simple: to help food, drink, beauty, and wellness leaders feel more informed, more prepared, more empowered in response to the growing threat to many CPG business models. Because as you will hear us say many times, this is no longer a story about weight loss. It's a story about appetite control, about long-term maintenance, changing occasions, and consumers who have become far more selective in what earns a place in their lives.
So if you haven't listened to GLP-1 Rewiring Consumption yet, make sure you do. But for now, stay with us because this is the debate where we push the implications further. This is Impact Makers, GLP-1, what happens next?
Okay, so what if the most important drug of the decade isn't really a weight loss drug at all?
What if it's a heart drug or a kidney drug, maybe even a cancer drug?
And what if it's also linked, for example, to slowing down the aging process?
Because as this story develops, our understanding of the true impacts of GLP-1 medications continues to build, and at a pace and with several unexpected twists and turns.
So previously, we brought together a range of experts to make sense of this unfolding story and its likely impact on consumer markets. And thousands of you streamed that episode, making it one of our most popular ever. So we thought, why not get the band back together again and do a sequel?
So, to update us on the facts and their implications, and speculate on how big this story might become over the next decade, we are delighted to welcome back Dr. Faris Zarakat, Assistant Professor of Nutritional Medicine at Columbia University, Dr. Paulina Lang, an Impact Makers regular, bringing a behavioral science lens to the party, another friend of the podcast, Fiala Meyering, who is MMR's Sensory Experience Director and is particularly interested in how GLP-1s impact the human senses. And spoiler alert, it's not necessarily in the way we first thought. And new to the panel, we've brought in Megan Borner-Powell, a senior strategist from brand experts Huxley, who advises on semiotics and culture. Welcome, everyone. Now, Faris, let's begin with you. When we first spoke about GLP-1s, there weren't many studies for us to draw upon. However, there was some emerging evidence that you did share suggesting GLP-1's weight-lowering effects appear to be largely acting on the brain. Since our first conversation, what's the biggest scientific shift that you've seen in the literature?
Yeah, there's been an explosion of literature since our last conversation, which is great. I think it's important to note that when we're thinking about weight loss and obesity treatment and appetite suppression, it's pretty well established that these GLP-1 receptor agonists are acting primarily on the brain, as we discussed. But kind of the changing landscape as we get more information is that potentially there are also what we would call peripheral effects of the GLP-1 receptor agonists as well. So there's a series of really nice reviews by some scientists like Jens Holst and Dan Drucker, who are really critical in actually identifying GLP-1 and characterizing its actions, that highlight the various tissues throughout the body that have these GLP-1 receptors, meaning that the GLP-1 receptor analogs, or the GLP-1 analogs rather, can bind to these receptors potentially throughout the body and exert their actions. And so what this means is, instead of looking specifically at glycemic control, which was, of course, the original mechanism of action of GLP-1 that we were focused on, moving to appetite suppression and body weight control, now there's more and more interest around these potential peripheral effects and expanding beyond the indication of type 2 diabetes and obesity to, for instance, cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, etc. So I'd say that is probably the biggest sort of advance that I've seen. And then beyond those more traditional sort of chronic diseases, cardiometabolic diseases, I think we talked a little bit about substance abuse disorder, right? And so this comes back to the potential central effects of the GLP-1 receptor agonists. So I guess briefly, more and more potential indications that could fall under the scope of these GLP-1 receptor agonist treatments.
Now, Faris, you mentioned their cardiovascular benefits. How robust is the evidence there now? Can the benefits be purely associated to weight loss, or is there something more interesting, perhaps more independent going on here?
I think perhaps is the key word, but I do think perhaps there is an independent effect of the GLP-1 receptor agonists, or these now they have co-agonists, dual agonists, triple agonists on cardiovascular system. So what I'll say is that the preclinical evidence is quite strong for a potential direct effect of GLP-1 binding to its receptor, activating these biological cascades to have a favorable effect on cardiovascular systems. I think we are still at a point where we cannot make conclusions about potential direct effects. What we can say, though, is that from these big, large-scale clinical trials assessing cardiovascular outcomes in response to GLP-1 receptor agonists versus placebo, for instance, or even versus older generation obesity pharmacotherapies, there's absolutely a significant reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. So whether it's major adverse cardiovascular events, reductions in biomarkers of cardiovascular disease risk, improvements in heart failure related outcomes, et cetera. So we're seeing something like a 15 to 20% reduction in risk for those kinds of cardiovascular events and diseases. But in terms of being able to really identify a direct effect, that's difficult to do because these medications have such marked effects on body weight, right? And we know that adiposity is hugely important in determining cardiovascular and cardiometabolic outcomes. So in other words, it's really hard in the context of these clinical trials to really sort of tease out weight-dependent versus weight-independent effects.
But, dependent or independent, is this evidence that could support wider adoption of these medications? Because there is something going on, whether you want to lose weight or not.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's an incredibly important point, Andy, is that, and I guess I would say this, and not to sound sort of flippant, but kind of who cares if the effects are dependent or independent of weight loss, right? We have such a huge proportion of the population worldwide with obesity, and we are seeing absolutely clinically significant reductions in cardiovascular events with treatment. So yes, absolutely, I do think that this can and will lead to greater adoption of the medications as we see their efficacy and ultimately effectiveness in improving outcomes beyond obesity, even if that's working through the reductions in body weight and adiposity.
And so what's the situation there around muscle loss? Because this continues to be widely reported and has contributed to endless food and beverage innovations claiming added protein. So what's the latest understanding?
This is more my space, right? As a nutrition scientist and somebody who's thinking about the food environment, I fear that a lot of the shifts that food industry are making may be a bit premature. This is where we have a real absence of data, is on how people's eating behaviors beyond energy intake is really shifting with these medications. And so we've got some bigger sort of observational data showing that nutritional quality is poor among GLP-1 users, but it's poor among non-GLP-1 users. And so the main takeaway, right, from lots and lots of data is that there is no evidence that there is a disproportionate amount of lean mass lost with GLP-1 receptor agonist treatment, right? So when an individual loses weight, they lose both body fat and they lose lean mass, right? And so lean mass is kind of a broad term. This is encompassing skeletal muscle. It's also encompassing organ mass, right? So it's a little bit broad, but in any case, the proportions of lean mass lost relative to total mass lost with GLP-1 receptor agonist induced weight loss is very similar to what you would see with lifestyle intervention alone. So certainly individuals are losing lean mass and likely losing some skeletal muscle, but not at an unusual or abnormal rate. And so when we think about protein, certainly protein aids in muscle recovery and can aid in muscle building. But to really build muscle, skeletal muscle, you need to engage in physical activity and particularly resistance training, right? So just, consuming more and more and more protein without increasing the physical activity is just going to lead to excretion of that extra protein, right? So I guess the short answer is the amount of lean mass lost relative to total mass is not unexpected, and protein supplementation could be very important, but only if the lifestyle changes are occurring.
Okay, so in this instance, the case for protein supplementation is only strengthened by that lifestyle changes you're indicating to really, support the impacts of that total mass loss alongside the lean mass loss. That's part of that as well. So if protein isn't necessarily going to be singularly critical, are there other ways that manufacturers can support consumers given this new information?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that, sure, enhancing protein content of foods is one option. I would also say that enhancing the nutrient composition, particularly of micronutrients, would be another sort of very important approach. So if we parallel this to metabolic and bariatric surgery, where individuals are losing 30 to 35% of their body weight, individuals are required to meet with a registered dietitian. So certainly increasing the nutrient density of options, and that, yes, that can include protein, but also, like I said, micronutrients as well. Ensuring that individuals are getting enough water, are hydrating enough, because there's some evidence that GLP-1 receptor agonist might also influence fluid intake. So these are things that I think are more critical than just increasing the protein, and then finding ways to tailor foods to the shifting eating behaviors of GLP-1 receptor agonist users, right? Individuals who are being treated with GLP-1 receptor agonists. So this is where we lack evidence, in my opinion, right? Are individuals consuming the same foods, but just in smaller portions? Are certain foods or certain taste profiles now aversive that might not have been before? Are certain taste profiles more attractive? And so we don't know enough about sort of the psychohedonic responses to these GLP-1 receptor agonists. And that, to me, is a much more promising area, if we could get the data, for the food industry to go, is to say, how can we address the potential changing perceptions, right? Sensory perceptions of these users, and then thinking about sort of tolerability, right? We know that these medications are delaying gastric emptying, right? So maybe smaller portions, less dense kinds of foods. So there is space for reformulation. I think it should certainly extend beyond protein, which seems to be sort of the hyper focus now.
Agreed. And I think just more generally, across different categories that we've done research in, where protein augmentation has become kind of a necessity to compete in the marketplace, we hear from consumers that it's reaching a saturation point. It's becoming something that's not necessarily believable or is so repetitive that it is easily lost in the mix. And the term that you used, nutrient dense, is something that we are seeing creeping in more and more frequently as a claim, particularly in support of GLP-1. So I think you're spot on with that, Ferris, and it's a likely trend that we'll see from our manufacturers going forward.
Yeah, and picking up on the sensory point you made there, Faris, we will be bringing in Fiala very shortly with some data on that. Now, look, if we fast forward to how people feel when they stop this medication, because we know that a vast proportion of people do stop within 12 months. The people that we've intercepted with our research is that they describe this fragile sort of transition period where appetite, cravings, old routines can really return very quickly. Do you have any further illuminations from clinical studies that give us some insight into what happens when people quit the meds?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite strong data that weight regain is rapid and substantial. And so we think about sort of the Surmount 4 study I think we mentioned last time, and now there's further follow-ups where individuals are treated with tirzepatide once weekly, lose substantial amount of body weight, and then are re-randomized to either stay on tirzepatide or switch to placebo. And you see marked weight regain. I think it's something like 80+% of those adults randomized to placebo after their weight loss regained at least 80% of the weight they'd lost.
Yeah.
And so absolutely. And I think what you're mentioning, Andy, that kind of more qualitative data is really important, right? To try to better understand what are patients experiencing. What is happening? We hear a lot about food noise, right? We talk, there's some studies now showing that this idea of food noise is suppressed when they're treated with these medications. And it seems like there's accumulating evidence that food noise is returning, right? And it's well known that there are biological systems in place in our body to promote energy storage, right? Fat storage, right? So when we lose weight, those systems are kicked on into extra drive, right? And so whether that's a significant disproportionate reduction in resting energy expenditure, or increased hedonic drive for palatable energy dense foods, these are all things that we know happen in the weight reduced state. And when we're thinking about such substantial weight loss, I think it's reasonable to assume that there will be, a really significant rebound in terms of what individuals are experiencing psychologically, physiologically, sort of psychohedonically. That's really the body kind of trying to drive them to consume and replenish those energy stores that have been depleted.
So, looking at what's coming next, orals, we've got monthly injections, triple agonists, as you've mentioned. How dramatically is the patient experience about to change? We know from MMR's research that 78% of GLP-1 users here in the US experience at least one negative side effect, mostly nausea, constipation, fatigue.
Yeah, I think that the pharmaceutical industry is really thinking about combination therapies and trying to address sort of what you're talking about, Caitlin, which is what are the concerns, right? So the major issues that we see are adverse side effects, gastrointestinal predominantly, but sometimes really substantial, right? Beyond the nausea, constipation is substantial. And so the response from the pharmaceutical industry is to say, how can we now target these more adverse effects to try to mitigate those? And so the switch to oral formulations, I think, is a potential game changer, right? The oral formulations these are once dailies. There are different types. So for instance, oral Wegovy is FDA approved, right, for the US. Something notable about oral Wegovy is that there are very important specifications about the timing of when that medication should be taken. I actually, as a little bit of an aside, think that might be somewhat problematic because now you need individuals to be very intentional about when they're taking that oral tablet. The point being is that there are new options beyond the injectables, right? And so some people may not like the injectable, they may not like needles, and so this offers another option that may be more acceptable to them, may be easier to follow. What I haven't seen yet, Caitlin, is a formulation that has markedly lower rates of adverse gastrointestinal side effects. And I could be wrong there, but just from my read of the literature, I haven't seen one that really is superior in that regard. I think that could be a real game changer.
So I was looking at MMR's research. They also looked at considerers of GLP-1s. They were not beginning the medication because of concerns over side effects.
Right. And we do see as well that up to 40% of our previous users reported that side effects were intolerable enough to mean that they won't go back on the medication. And to harken back to your earlier point, Ferris, it sounds like with the appropriate lifestyle changes adjacent to some of these medications, you can soften the blow of some of these side effects. But we've still got a long way to go to make these a simple medication to take to achieve the results that people are looking to without disrupting their lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I mean, again, I think that this is not something that is lost upon the pharmaceutical industry. You know, they are, I think, making efforts and thinking about, are there different ways? And I know there's ongoing studies that are, you know, assessing if lower doses can be as effective, tailoring doses, changing titration schedules, et cetera. But I would say, Caitlin, I think we're still a ways away from that, like, you know, magic formulation that is like, wow, I am experiencing 20% weight loss over the course of a year and have no side effects whatsoever.
Do you think that will come,
so
Ferris?
yeah, I find it hard to believe. What I do think is that as more and more options enter the market, it's a better and better thing for patients because now they have the ability to work with their physicians, ideally, and determine, you know, test out different combinations, test out different medications to see what suits them best, what is most tolerable for them.
I think you're right because it's such an individual journey. So somebody will get several side effects, somebody else won't. Certain formulations suit certain people. And as you say, it's about finding the right formulation for the right person. One of the things that caught our eye recently is they're bringing onto the market a weight maintenance pill. As I understand it, this is something that you would take once you come off the traditional GLP-1 medication. From my point of view, I see this as the game changer because people have got more incentive in the first place to go on GLP-1s because they will lose the weight, but crucially, they'll be able to keep it off. But that will involve appetite regulation, relatively lowering cost, these pills. But I think the key point is it's potentially ongoing, you know, potentially for life. And then we're talking about appetite regulation for people all over the world for a long period of time. And that is massive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is a game changer. And so the medication you're referring to is orforglipron, which is what we mentioned before. This is formulated by Eli Lilly. So again, it's a once daily oral tablet that doesn't have all the restrictions of a traditional incretin mimetic GLP-1 analog. And what they showed recently in a really nice study led by a friend and colleague, Lou Aroni, was that individuals that were treated with semaglutide or tirzepatide and lost substantial body weight were then randomly assigned to begin this oral small molecule versus placebo. And for both semaglutide and tirzepatide, those individuals who were randomized to receive this oral small molecule or orforglipron maintained greater weight loss than those individuals who are basically switched off, who were put onto the placebo. So this is a potentially important route forward to increase uptake, increase maintenance of individuals using these medications.
So, Ferris, if you had to give us the most critical scientific finding from the last 12 months that you think manufacturers are currently failing to grasp, what would it be?
That's a difficult question. I think the most critical sort of advance in our knowledge is that the GLP-1 receptor agonists, that these new generation obesity pharmacotherapies are able to improve so many health outcomes beyond body weight and glycemic control. And maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise. As we mentioned, we know that obesity is a key causal risk factor for, I think it's something like 8 out of the leading 10 causes of preventable deaths. I can only speak to the US's healthcare system, but one of the key barriers to individuals utilizing these really effective new generation obesity pharmacotherapies is cost, is access, right? And there's a lot of push now to have insurance companies cover these medications, as well as government programs like Medicare and Medicaid. So now it's approved for individuals with obstructive sleep apnea, which is covered by insurance companies, right? There's, again, moves towards getting this approved for the indication of chronic kidney disease, for heart failure. I think expansion of indications is a really promising way to expand access and enhance affordability in addition to these new kind of developments of oral formulations, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's pretty amazing how that list of peripheral and unexpected benefits seems to continue to grow and grow. And, we're obviously excited to see where it takes us next. But for a minute here, let me add something new to the mix, because recently the New York Times reported that two of the hottest trends in health, longevity medicine and weight loss drugs, of course, are now colliding. And a new study shows that among people with HIV, taking semaglutides for 8 months seemed to slow participants' biological aging. What can you tell us about that, Ferris?
I will say that HIV is a little bit out of my area of expertise. But what I will say, right, to the point that we were just making, is that if you improve body weight, you will improve health outcomes, right? If you are improving your body weight and then as a consequence, improving your cholesterol levels, improving your blood sugar, your glycemic control, improving blood pressure, and whatever additional sort of downstream, inflammation is a big one, right? You're reducing your markers of inflammation. Therefore, you're reducing the risk of developing chronic diseases. And as a consequence, you're likely living a healthier life and a longer life, right? So I think it's fine to call it a longevity medication. I pause there.
But I think it's an example of how new information is constantly emerging, albeit sketchy at first. But, here's a reckoning point in our discussion so far. So if GLP-1s was just like obesity drugs, the commercial impacts, as have already been forecast, are quite significant. But, through this debate, we've been hearing that the science is moving well beyond weight loss, study after study. So we're talking, as you have, about applications around cardiovascular health, metabolic disease, inflammation, liver, kidney conditions, addiction, you mentioned, longevity, perhaps. So what happens if appetite and metabolism control becomes mainstream, a sort of long-term adult health management system? If we use the US as our anchor, current forecasts suggest that around 7 to 10% of US adults could be using GLP-1s actively by 2030. But those forecasts are largely built around obesity and type 2 diabetes. So I did some number crunching working with Claude, as we do these days. And I wanted to try and get some help in estimating the potential headspace for GLP-1 style meds when you factor in all of these incremental benefits that seem to be coming through, independent or dependent. We came up with an estimate that by 2035, it would be plausible and defensible to suggest that in the region of 40% of US adults could be using some form of appetite weight maintenance or metabolic control medication, either actively or intermittently. And also, this is not just about more people, this is about more people for longer. And with this scenario, we are talking about immense change in appetite, in portion expectations in satiety and reward and impulse purchasing and food culture around the world, Brazil, for example.
Absolutely, Andrew. And what really makes the scenario more credible is that the barriers are already starting to come down. So, in our US research, 88% of GLP-1 considerers told us they would be much more likely to start if the next generation of medicines were more affordable and came with fewer side effects. So, it's not just about scientific possibility, it's also about access, tolerability, and confidence. If the medicines become cheaper, easier to take, and easier to stay on, and if maintenance options help people feel there is a safer after phase, then the pool of potential users expands dramatically.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very valid. And I think your estimates that you and Claude came up with are reasonable, especially when you think about the proportion of adults in the US with obesity, right? Which is nearing 50%. Um, and then if you take into account those individuals with overweight, BMI status, that number increases substantially. I want to just pause to note, I think is important, is that at present, these medications are only approved for the treatment of obesity and comorbid conditions,
Yeah.
or type 2 diabetes independently because of their glycemic regulatory effects. So I bring that up to say, we have to be careful thinking about this as well, in that if we have individuals who are trying to use these medications who do not have excess adiposity, we could be running into issues, right? Because there is going to be that appetite suppressant effect, especially with these new generation incretin mimetics. And so that's a whole kind of can of worms that I find a little bit worrisome. This is not a cosmetic medication, right? This is a medication, as we've been talking about, for the treatment of a chronic disease. But to Andy's point, we are absolutely in the face of a worldwide global obesity epidemic, right? And so there's a large proportion of the global population who would absolutely benefit from these medications. And so, as your data indicates, the potential reach of these medications is vast. And I do completely agree with the comment you made, Caitlin, about as newer generations arrive, if they are addressing these sort of major barriers that are, it seems, currently access, cost, right, affordability, and tolerability, then you would certainly see greater uptake. And I think that would be a really great thing, worldwide for public health. But I would also say we need more support, right? These individuals that are taking these medications need behavioral support. They need information. They need guidance to make sure that they're meeting their nutrient needs, that they're engaging in physical activity, that they're doing other health promoting activities, that they're using the medications in the way that they were intended to be used. But if all of those things are met in a perfect scenario, this could absolutely change the sort of the global marketplace in many ways. And one of the ways that Andrew mentioned that I completely agree with is the food industry, right? And how we interact with food and how we seek different foods and beverages, and the whole experience that comes with that could be altered. And I think that's something that restaurants, that the dining industry, that the food industry need to be thinking about. And I think they are thinking about is how do we cater to a growing population of individuals that are using these medications for the treatment of obesity and overweight and any comorbidities.
Absolutely. It's certainly a very complex and nuanced situation across all fronts. And we're all kind of learning as we go and adapting to these changes that we've noted seem to emerge and evolve with each passing day. I think it's a good time to bring in our behavioral science expert here, Paulina. Paulina, when we think about how big GLP-1s could potentially become across society and the globe, as Ferris has mentioned, what perspective does behavioral science offer us?
So one of the things behavioral science gives us is a way of looking beyond what people choose and asking instead what's shaping the choice in the first place. So the choice architecture around all of us. And when I look at what's happening with GLP-1s, my mind goes straight to the speed and scale of uptake across the globe and what that means for these drugs slowly becoming the default answer to weight management. So what we know from behavioral economics is that defaults are far more powerful than almost any other intervention because they take so much of the decision-making and effort out of the equation by changing that choice architecture. So if GLP-1s become the default intervention for people struggling with obesity, which is a very important point to make that Faris mentioned earlier, other ways of losing weight start to feel a lot less appealing. No one likes being on a diet, of course, and constantly thinking about the things they're denying themselves. Also, most experts advise making long-term, sustainable lifestyle changes, not just to temporarily cut something out or maybe dial up your exercise for a few weeks and then stop. So that's exactly why GLP-1s are so attractive. They essentially guarantee results, but of course not without any negatives. There's a cost and side effects, as Faris outlined earlier, but it's likely that those will become less prominent as the drugs continue to develop. So for someone who struggles with obesity, GLP-1s are probably going to become that default route to losing weight and actually sustaining that impact long term, especially combined with lifestyle changes or the maintenance medication we've also discussed earlier. And there's a second piece too, that this huge behavior change we're seeing, and that's spillover and social norms. So we're already seeing non-users adapt how they eat, how they talk about food, what normal portion sizes or indulgence even look like now, and also what's on the shelves for them to choose from, because the norms around food are shifting around those who are not on the medication as well. And of course, this isn't just down to GLP-1s, it's a convergence of trends around health span, longevity, protein for muscle building, and so on. But GLP-1s are one of the most influential of those trends at the moment, and they look like they're here to stay because they keep evolving and improving, removing barriers to entry and to long-term use. And that's classic social proof and behavioral science. But what's different this time is the speed. So we haven't seen diffusion like this before. And the big reason is that social media has basically done the marketing for it. It's organic, it's at scale, it's faster than any public health campaign ever could be. A single video of someone's transformation or a kind of report of their experience can reach millions of people in a day with none of the friction of a public health campaign, no committee approval, no ethics approvals, no media buy. It's peer-to-peer, it's believable, it feels authentic, and it spreads through trust in a way institutional messaging just can't replicate. So that's why the norm shift, I think, is happening in a matter of months and not years.
So given the societal implications and the near immediate and universal distribution of information that we see across media, if Andrew's projection is anywhere near right in terms of controlled diets, what could this mean for society's relationship with food?
Honestly, I think if that projection holds, I think it raises a genuinely behavioral and maybe, dare I even say, philosophical question. So if we paint a picture based on that projection where 40% of people are on GLP-1s, we're looking at a society that, yes, is healthier, lives longer, impulse and addiction are dampened, but also so is pleasure. And pleasure is a huge driver of behavior for good and for bad. So we are hedonists by nature. We choose things that give us pleasure, make us feel good, short-term and long-term. And food has historically been one of the biggest carriers of pleasure and impulse in daily life. So to me, the question becomes, what happens to that hedonic contract that we've always had with food, where indulgence and even a bit of loss of control was kind of part of the deal, really? and I'll be honest, I'm someone who loves dystopian fiction, so my brain goes there a little. And I wonder, does this lead to kind of liberation from overabundance and regaining control over our lives? Or is it quite a dystopian vision where we lose a huge source of pleasure, joy, and become much more rational creatures who see food purely as fuel for our bodies? And so far from what we're seeing, GLP-1s don't make hedonism completely disappear. I think what we're seeing with GLP-1 users isn't that they stop indulging altogether. It's that they become more intentional about it. They treat themselves still, less frequently, smaller volumes, but they still do. They also enjoy being able to have a tub of ice cream in the freezer without the fear of accidentally eating the whole thing in one sitting. And that can deliver to a different and maybe, yes, more rational sense of pleasure. It also opens up other ways we can enjoy food beyond just taste and then quantity. Things like the product experience, the unboxing, the ritual of it, the sensory of theater around a small treat will, I think, become really important.
Now, Megan, we haven't forgotten about you, and I know you've been patiently and pensively considering the cultural perspective throughout this very insightful discussion. When we say controlled consumption, how far does that go?
So, Caitlin, I think it could go much further than most food brands might be prepared for currently, because it's not just a diet trend. It is a cultural rupture. So GLP-1s raise a bigger question for me, which is what happens when desire itself becomes adjustable? And I want to pick up on Paulina's point about this dystopian future, and that's a kind of idea that I want to run with. So if we think about what a cultural lens helps us to understand in terms of what that extreme could look like in terms of where controlled consumption could go, I want to map that across a couple of big tensions which represent these axes of extreme poles. So the first tension is total tracking versus total release. So at one end, you have eating becoming a data project. So it's where someone becomes quite obsessive about their blood sugar levels, tracking their protein, their calories, their metabolic scores. And so you almost treat your body as a dashboard with all these different metrics that you're able to follow. And so that's the total tracking. The other end of that is total release, where the promise is freedom from constant calculation. So there's no more food noise, no more bargaining with yourself at the supermarket, and no more thinking about eating all day. That's one axis. The other one is looking at the tension between shame and acceptance. So on one end, GLP-1 use is treated as cheating. And then on the other hand, it could become something that is completely normal. So it's something that is prescribed, it's supported, it's something that you see at pharmacies and food retail. So in this context, the question is whether controlled consumption remains quite morally suspect, or whether it just becomes completely ordinary and everyday.
So what you've just taken us through there, Megan, is 4 possible worlds, right?
Yes, it is. So I'm quite obsessed with a 2x2 matrix. So if you take those 2 tensions that I've just described and plot them as axes, it gets you to 4 different quadrants. So these become 4 cultural stress tests in terms of those extremes of where controlled consumption could go. So each of them helps you answer the question is, if controlled consumption accelerates in these different directions, what could happen to the cultural meaning of food?
Okay.
And I've seen this play out in interesting ways among partners and friends who travel together or who are often indulging together on a regular basis, where one goes on GLP-1s and the other does not. I've heard everything from we intended to have this culinary vacation and my partner could only take a bite of the delicacy that we had been longing to try for years, to my drinking buddy is now much more boring, that they're not as interested in imbibing alongside me. So there's a really interesting halo effect going on there as well among those who aren't taking the drugs when participating in their regular activities with those who are. So dabbing into these worlds a little bit, let's start with the world where GLP-1s are still judged, but people are tracking everything.
Yeah, so in this quadrant, you have a group of people who we can call the proof point eaters. So the drug might be doing part of the work, but culture still demands that they're showing and demonstrating visible effort. So people use data as moral evidence to demonstrate, for example, I'm tracking my glucose, I'm hitting my protein, I'm preserving muscle, I'm doing this properly. And the risk of this happening is that health becomes a performance. So for brands, the role is to provide those proof points. So it's proving that someone's hitting their protein goals. It's using very clinically coded packaging cues and transparent products that help people feel like they are doing controlled consumption properly in this kind of performative way.
So what happens, Megan, when the shame disappears entirely, but the tracking stays?
What we get in this quadrant, where we have the tracking, but it's something kind of very normal and accepted, is we get what I've called the metabolic citizen. So this is a very institutional way of looking at controlled consumption, where GLP-1s become completely normal and metabolic health becomes everyday literacy. So you'll expect to see people treating their glucose response, their satiety, and their muscle preservation almost like personal schools. The hope in this world or this scenario is that there's more support, there's more prevention, and there's less blame for people who take this route. But the risk is that we enter this permanent optimization contract where the supermarket, the pharmacy, the app, and the clinic will start to merge together, and you end up with brands having to become a sort of form of compliance within what has become quite a rigid healthcare ecosystem.
And what about the backlash, Megan? Because surely not everyone wants their appetite managed by medicine or apps or quote unquote biomarkers.
No, exactly. So what you get in this quadrant where we don't have that sense of control is the pleasure resistance. So here food becomes a line in the sand. You have enough of a kind of mass of people who are rejecting the idea that hunger, craving, or pleasure are problems to solve. And eating here becomes this form of kind of defending messiness or tradition or appetite or our bodies or the social life that we get where it's all built around food. So everyone and everything in this world refuses to fit within that very neat, that dashboard that I previously described. And the hope here is that we preserve the idea that food is so integral to culture. It's not just fuel, as we've had before. But the risk is that we have a polarization. So you have this cultural debate or discourse where real food is pitted against engineered food. So for brands here, what we'd expect them to see if there is this groundswell movement is that brands are defending joy. So they're ensuring that flavor, provenance, ritual, and shared meals all are retained as part of that product experience, and they're not apologizing for pleasure.
And there is then that possible world you mentioned, Megan, that feels to me the most radical. It's where GLP-1s are normal across society and people genuinely feel free from all that food noise we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think this is maybe the one that makes me feel the saddest. I've called it the quiet appetite. And I think this is the scenario that should make food and drink brands maybe sit up a bit more or feel a bit more nervous, because it changes how much food matters in culture and society. So if you just imagine millions of people no longer wandering into the kitchen for a little hit of comfort, there's less impulse snacking, we have fewer cravings, food no longer punctuates boredom or stress or celebration or doesn't mark reward in the same way. And even though this sounds liberating for a lot of people, what it could do at a mass scale is that it becomes quite existential for an industry that is built on frequent moments and occasions and impulse and this feeling of abundance.
So what is the role of food brands in that world?
In this world, brands will have to make food worth choosing and not just easy to consume, I would say.
Yeah. So if you had to leave, the many food and beverage brands that will be tuning in with one provocation here, what would it be?
I would say that brands should stop treating GLP-1s as a niche weight loss issue. And we've had that from all the different perspectives today. It is a cultural reset in many ways in the relationship between appetite, identity, and consumption. And so the old models that we have in our minds of food that assumes that there's always going to be more occasions, more cravings, more permissibility, more abundance. And what we get in this conversation around controlled consumption is what happens when more is no longer the engine behind our industry.
Well, a lot to think about. Thank you, everyone, so far. I think we should have a short break, shouldn't we?
Your innovation team has got your product nearly right, and then the last 5% changes everything. A texture, a finish, a detail that makes everything feel worth it. MMR, for the part that does the real work.
So we're here with Faris Zirakat from the Irving Medical Center at Columbia University, Paulina Lang, MMR Group's Head of Behavioral Science, Megan Buona-Powell, semiotician and cultural commentator with brand strategist Huxley, and Fiala Mering, who is Product Experience Director, one of the original band members. Welcome back, Fiala. How are we feeling?
Very good, thank you, Andrew.
So we've barely touched on many of the sensory revelations from MMR's new consumer research. So can you help us out here?
Yeah, well, where to start, Andrew? I mean, one of the most surprising findings from the research was that for some users, GLP-1s were not actually dampening taste experience, but they may actually be enhancing them. Now, that type of insight is going to be invaluable for food and drink manufacturers seeking to meet that evolving consumer need. Perhaps the biggest unanswered question, though, is why taste perception changes at all. How much it is physiological and how much of it is psychological. So, for example, does making the conscious decision to take GLP-1s alter the way people perceive food? What role do those cravings and motivations play in shaping the eating experience? And what sensory characteristics are required then to meet that need? However, there is going to be a balancing act here, because brands will need to determine how best to serve a growing cohort of GLP-1 users whilst continuing to meet the needs of a broader consumer base.
So if incident rates of GLP-1 type appetite suppressants do escalate, then what's your take on how we consume and how manufacturers might develop products in the future?
That would be a big shift, but I mean, it sounds entirely plausible given sort of the other things we've been discussing today about the potential uses. Hence, for this increasing chunk of the population, demand seems to be shifting away from want towards need. Choices become much more intentional, less driven by cravings. Now, that means that every bite has to count, not just in terms of nutrition, but also taste. Essentially, that question chain from do I want this to is this worth it? And worth it is not the same as liked. So brands are going to have to work harder to make their products feel truly worth it to people who perhaps aren't feeling strong hunger cues. Now, all this is going to force the food industry to rethink how to create loyalty. So, yes, there will be an impact on manufacturers. The rise of GLP-1 users heralds a shift towards more purposeful, more need-based eating.
Right. We already know that GLP-1 users gravitate to safe, lighter, simpler foods, so effectively things that are easy to digest and not too intense. What does this mean for manufacturers? How can they ensure that their products maintain that loyalty?
There's going to have to be a sensory recalibration, for sure. Changes in taste could even mean that experiences can quickly become overwhelming. So what used to be pleasantly indulging now quickly trips into too much. And as a result, consumers start selecting foods that sit in what I'd like to call a safe sensory window. That's where flavour and texture and mouthfeel are predictable, manageable, repeatable. So what that means is that flavour needs recalibration, not maximisation. It's about balance rather than impact. And portion size interacts with perception. Fundamentally, fewer bites means bites have to carry more sensory weight. And now this may leave space for texture to play a bigger role. And I'm actually really interested to see how this goes, whether texture, if it goes the same way, for example, does smooth, soft, easy to swallow formats reduce effort and perceived risk?
Okay, Fiala. Here's a big question for you because, for decades, manufacturers have relied on immediate sensory gratification and, how we measure that in terms of liking and overall appeal. And so much of what we're discovering about GLP-1's effect on the senses is invalidating this immediate sensory gratification.
Yeah, absolutely. The product testing is going to have to adapt. It's a move away from optimizing, from maximizing liking at the point of consumption, because what we're observing is a shift from immediate hedonic response to a more sustained experiential fit. Now, in sensory terms, that means we need to think beyond intensity and ask, does the product remain comfortable across repeated exposure? Does it create a sense of control rather than a loss of control? Does it deliver consistent, predictable sensory cues that can build trust? So we're going to have to pay more attention to repeatability. Can I come back to this easily? Tolerance.
Yeah.
Does it stay pleasant across multiple bites and occasions? And emotional reassurance through sensory cues. And getting there will require combining sensory science, expert panels with product experience, consumer research. And kind of in the spirit of helping a little bit, I can see that MMR's Sensory Bot could address many of those challenges to understand holistically how to optimize those products and more fundamentally the experience of consuming them. But the real shift is we're no longer designing for a single moment of liking. We're designing for how a product lives with someone over time.
Okay.
Fiala, we appreciate your perspectives as always. In summary, GLP-1s may force our industry to reduce dependence on immediate gratification and find additional ways to build emotional resonance with consumers via branding and product experience. Final question for everyone, and I promise it doesn't need to be a long answer. If each of you had to place one bet on what brands will need to understand about GLP-1s over the next 5 years, what would it be? Ferris, I'll kick it to you first.
Yeah, I think as we've talked about, that there needs to be recognition that these new generation incretin-mimetic therapies, these GLP-1 receptor agonists, are here to stay. They are having a positive influence well beyond obesity treatment. These are really going to be seen as cardiovascular and metabolic health medications, not simply obesity treatments. So I think that this is going to potentially really expand the uptake of these medications as they become more cost-effective, more accessible. There's greater insurance coverage. So I think that this is really, we're going to see more and more individuals that are going to be treated with these medications for a variety of obesity-related comorbidities. And so I think with this also creates opportunities, right? So we can think about, as we move forward, what are ways to further increase access? What are ways to mitigate the potential adverse side effects, predominantly gastrointestinal? How can we minimize lean mass loss and particularly skeletal mass loss? And are there combination therapies? Are there ways that other industries can come in and sort of satisfy some of these areas for improvement?
Over to you, Paulina.
So I think that brands need to stop thinking of this as a weight loss story and start thinking of it as a normalization of appetite control. So managing hunger, cravings, food noise, that's going to become the norm, and not just for people on GLP-1s, but for most people around them. And the new default people will measure themselves against will include smaller portions and more intentional choices. And the brands that win will be the ones who understand that trade-off sitting underneath that. The people will gain control, but they may lose some spontaneity, some indulgent freedom. And the brands that figure out how to give people back a little of that in smaller, maybe smarter ways are the ones with a future in this.
Megan, your final thoughts?
I wanted to build on Paulina's idea about control. I think it's really important from a cultural perspective that the discourse and the positioning of products doesn't go so far in the direction of agency that it's all about this kind of very clinical, tracked way of engaging with our appetites. It doesn't lose the real pleasure and joy behind food. So it's avoiding that quadrant that I described where food is something that's tracked, but also that control is a way of mitigating the guilt and the shame and the stigma. And so ideally brands take a position that talks about intentionality and choice, but in a way that still celebrates that kind of sociability and joy and pleasure that is so culturally important and grounding in food.
And Fiala, take us out on a sensory note.
I bet the biggest mistake brands make will be in treating GLP-1 as a portion size problem. And it's really an experience problem. That's my bet.
Well, we are thrilled that we all made the time to make this happen. And one thing's for sure, it's a story that's going to run and run.
and likely in further unexpected ways. So be assured, this probably isn't the last time we get to play again. See you on the next episode.
Goodbye.